Hi guys! Tonight, we're stepping back in time to explore one of history's most overlooked yet fascinating lives, that of a medieval peasant. For centuries, these hard-working individuals formed the backbone of European society, yet their stories often go untold in favor of kings, knights, and nobles. But what was it really like to wake up each morning in a small thatched cottage, to work the same fields your father and grandfather worked before you, to live a life bound by the rhythms of the seasons and the demands of your lord? Tonight, we'll follow the daily existence of Thomas Miller, a fictional but historically accurate peasant living in 14th century England, and discover the remarkable complexity, struggles, and small joys that defined medieval rural life. Okay, friends, before you settle in, if you enjoy this kind of deep dive content, then click the like button and don't forget to subscribe. And yes, leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I really enjoy seeing where everyone is listening from. Now, dim the lights and turn on the fan, and let's dive into tonight's journey together. Thomas Miller opened his eyes to the familiar creak of wooden beams above his head and the soft breathing of his family around him. The single room of their cottage housed not just Thomas and his wife Margaret, but also their 3 children. Young William, barely 10 years old, Mary at 8, and little Anne, who had just turned 5. The dawn light filtered through the small, unglazed window opening, casting long shadows across the packed earth floor. There was no glass in their window. Such luxuries were reserved for the wealthy. Instead, a wooden shutter could be closed against the worst of the weather, though it left them in near darkness when shut. The cottage itself was modest by any standard, measuring roughly 20 feet by 15 feet. The walls were made of wattle and daub, a framework of wooden strips woven together like a basket, then covered with a mixture of mud, clay, and straw. The construction of these walls required considerable skill and represented a significant investment of time and materials for a peasant family. The wooden framework had to be carefully planned and assembled, with vertical posts driven into the ground and horizontal members woven between them to create a strong but flexible structure. The spaces between the wooden strips were then filled with a carefully mixed daub made from local clay, chopped straw, and sometimes animal hair or dung to bind the mixture together. The application of the daub was an art in itself, requiring the right consistency to stick to the wattlework without cracking as it dried. Too much water made the mixture run off the walls, while too little made it difficult to work and likely to crack. The clay had to be selected from deposits that would provide good binding properties, and the straw had to be cut to the proper length and mixed in the correct proportions. Some builders added lime to the mixture when it was available, as this improved the durability and weather resistance of the finished wall. The roof was thatched with wheat straw, carefully layered and bound to keep out the rain. Thatching was a specialized craft that required years of training to master, and a skilled thatcher was one of the most valued craftsmen in the village community. The process began with the selection of suitable straw, which had to be long, straight, and free from grain that might attract vermin. The straw was sorted by length and quality, with the best material reserved for the visible outer layers of the roof and lesser grades used for the inner courses. The actual thatching began at the bottom edge of the roof and worked upward, with each course of straw overlapping the one below it to shed water effectively. The straw was laid in bundles called yelms, which were carefully positioned and secured with wooden spars or twisted straw ropes. The thatcher used a variety of specialized tools to shape and compact the thatch, creating a smooth, weather-resistant surface that could last for decades with proper maintenance. The ridge of the roof required particular skill, as this area was most exposed to wind and rain and needed extra protection to prevent water from penetrating the structure. A central hearth provided warmth and a place to cook, though the smoke had to find its way out through a simple hole in the roof, often filling the room with an acrid haze that made eyes water and lungs ache. The hearth was more than just a cooking and heating facility. It was the center of family life and the focal point around which the cottage was organized. The construction of the hearth required careful attention to fire safety, as a poorly built fireplace could easily lead to a catastrophic fire that would destroy not only the family's home, but potentially the entire village. The hearth itself was typically built of stones mortared together with clay, raised slightly above the floor level to improve draft and reduce the risk of fire spreading. The surrounding area was paved with flat stones or tiles to protect the combustible floor materials, and a simple chimney hood might be constructed to help direct smoke toward the roof opening. Iron hooks and chains suspended over the fire provided places to hang cooking pots, while iron trivets and pot stands allowed vessels to be placed directly over the coals for different types of cooking. The management of the fire required constant attention and considerable skill. Wood had to be selected for different purposes: softwoods for quick-burning kindling, hardwoods for long-lasting coals, and special woods for smoking meat or adding flavor to food. The fire had to be maintained continuously during cold weather, as rekindling it was a laborious process that involved striking flint against steel to create sparks that could ignite prepared tinder. Banking the fire at night involved carefully arranging coals and ashes to preserve heat while minimizing the risk of the fire spreading or going out completely. The floor was nothing more than packed earth, covered here and there with rushes and straw to provide some insulation from the cold and damp. The preparation and maintenance of these floor coverings was an important household task that affected both comfort and health. Fresh rushes had to be gathered from marshy areas near the village, cut at the proper time of year when they were mature but not yet beginning to decay. The rushes were dried thoroughly before being brought into the cottage, as damp materials could promote the growth of mold and create unhealthy conditions. The floor coverings served multiple purposes beyond simple insulation. They absorbed spilled liquids and food scraps, helping to keep the cottage cleaner and more sanitary. Herbs were often mixed with the rushes to provide pleasant scents and to deter insects and vermin. Lavender, mint, and other aromatic plants helped mask the odors that inevitably accumulated in the close quarters of peasant cottages. The rushes also provided a softer surface for children to play on and for adults to sit on during the long winter evenings when outdoor work was impossible. Regular replacement of the floor coverings was necessary to maintain sanitary conditions and prevent the accumulation of harmful bacteria and parasites. Old rushes had to be removed and disposed of carefully, often being composted or used as bedding for animals. The earthen floor itself required periodic maintenance, as heavy use and seasonal changes in moisture could create uneven surfaces and drainage problems. New earth might be added and compacted to fill in low spots, while drainage channels might be dug around the cottage to prevent water from seeping through the floor during wet seasons. The cottage's single window opening was another area that required careful design and maintenance. Glass was far too expensive for peasant families, so the opening was simply a hole in the wall that could be covered with a wooden shutter during bad weather. The size and placement of this opening represented a compromise between the need for light and ventilation and the requirements for warmth and security. Too large an opening would make the cottage difficult to heat, while too small would leave the interior dark and poorly ventilated. The wooden shutter that covered the window had to be carefully crafted to fit tightly and resist warping from changes in humidity. It was typically made from several boards joined together with wooden pegs or iron nails when these were available. The shutter was hinged with leather straps or simple wooden pivots, and it could be secured from the inside with wooden bars or leather ties. During mild weather, the shutter might be left partially open to allow light and air to enter, while still providing some protection from wind and rain. The interior arrangement of the cottage was dictated by practical necessity and the need to make efficient use of the limited space available. The area immediately around the hearth was reserved for cooking and eating, with wooden benches or stools providing seating for the family. Cooking utensils, dishes, and food supplies were stored on shelves or in wooden chests placed against the walls. Sleeping areas were typically located in the corners farthest from the door, where they would be warmest and most private. Thomas stretched his aching muscles as he sat up on the straw mattress he shared with Margaret. At 35 years old, he was already considered middle-aged by medieval standards, and his body bore the marks of decades of hard physical labor. His hands were calloused and scarred from handling farm tools, his back permanently bent from countless hours stooped over crops, and his face weathered from years of working under sun, wind, and rain. He wore the same clothes he had worked in the day before: a rough wool tunic that reached his knees, linen undergarments that had seen better days, and woolen hose that were patched in several places. His feet were wrapped in leather shoes that he had cobbled himself, using scraps of hide and sinew to create something that would protect his feet from stones and thorns. Margaret stirred beside him, her own day beginning with the familiar routine that had governed their lives for the 15 years of their marriage. She was 32, her face lined with the stress of constant work and worry, but her eyes still held the warmth that had first drawn Thomas to her at a harvest festival so many years ago. Her long brown hair was braided and covered with a simple linen cap, as was proper for a married woman. Her dress was made of the same rough wool as Thomas's tunic, dyed brown with oak bark and shaped into a simple garment that prioritized function over fashion. Over this, she wore a sleeveless surcoat that helped protect her dress from the worst of the dirt and wear. The children began to wake as their parents stirred. William, the eldest, was already showing signs of the man he would become, tall for his age and strong from helping with farm work since he could walk. He wore a smaller version of his father's clothing and took his responsibilities seriously, knowing that as the eldest son, he would likely inherit his father's position and obligations. Mary and Anne shared a smaller straw mattress on the other side of the room. Mary was beginning to help her mother with household tasks, learning the skills she would need as a wife and mother. Little Anne, still young enough to play, clutched a small doll made from straw and scraps of cloth, one of the few toys in their household. The family's morning routine began, as it did every day, with a simple breakfast of porridge made from whatever grain was available. This morning it was barley, boiled with water and flavored with a small amount of salt if they were fortunate. Meat was a luxury they could afford only rarely, perhaps at Christmas or Easter, or when one of their chickens stopped laying eggs and was destined for the pot. Their diet consisted mainly of porridge, bread made from whatever grain they could grow or afford, vegetables from their small garden plot, and occasionally eggs from their few chickens. Milk came from their single cow when she was producing, and cheese was made when there was excess milk to preserve. Thomas stepped outside into the cool morning air to check on their small collection of animals. Behind their cottage was a small yard enclosed by a rough wooden fence. Here lived their most precious possessions: a cow named Bessie, 3 chickens, a rooster, and a pig named Grunt, who was being fattened for slaughter in the autumn. These animals represented security and survival for the family. The cow provided milk when she was fresh, and her calf would either become a replacement for Bessie or be sold for desperately needed coin. The chickens provided eggs when they were laying, and the pig would provide meat to sustain them through the long winter months. The cow was perhaps their most valuable possession apart from their cottage itself. Bessie was a small, hardy breed suited to the rough conditions of medieval farming. She was brown with white patches, patient and gentle enough for the children to handle when helping with milking duties. Thomas checked her over carefully each morning, looking for signs of injury or illness that could spell disaster for his family. A sick or dead cow could mean the difference between survival and starvation, especially during the harsh winter months when other food sources became scarce. After tending to the animals, Thomas gathered his tools for another day of work in the fields. His most important tool was his plow, a heavy wooden implement tipped with iron that could break through the tough clay soil of their region. The plow had been his father's before him, and his grandfather's before that, carefully maintained and repaired over the generations. The maintenance of this essential tool was a constant concern that required both skill and precious materials. The wooden parts had to be inspected regularly for cracks, splits, or wear that could lead to failure during critical planting or cultivation periods. The iron components of the plow were particularly valuable and required specialized care. The plowshare, which cut through the soil, had to be kept sharp through regular visits to the village blacksmith. This involved not only the cost of the smith's services, but also the time lost from fieldwork while the tool was being repaired. Thomas had learned to do simple sharpening himself using a whetstone, but major repairs required the skills and equipment that only a trained blacksmith possessed. The iron coulter, which sliced vertically through the soil ahead of the plowshare, also needed regular attention to keep it properly aligned and sharp. The wooden beam that connected the plow to the yoke had to be strong enough to withstand the tremendous stress of breaking tough ground, while remaining light enough for the oxen to pull efficiently. This beam was typically made from seasoned oak or ash, carefully selected for its strength and grain pattern. Cracks in the beam could be repaired with iron bands or wooden splints, but eventually the entire piece would need to be replaced. Finding suitable timber for plow construction was becoming increasingly difficult as forests were cleared for agriculture, making the maintenance of existing tools even more crucial. The plow's moldboard, which turned the soil over after it was cut, required precise shaping to work effectively in different types of soil. Too flat, and it would not turn the earth completely. Too curved, and it would create excessive resistance that would tire the oxen unnecessarily. The moldboard was typically made of wood, sometimes reinforced with iron strips, and had to be replaced periodically as it wore down from constant contact with abrasive soil. Adjusting the moldboard's angle and position was an art that Thomas had learned through years of experience, and different adjustments were needed for different seasons and soil conditions. Alongside the plow, he carried a mattock for breaking up clods of earth, a sickle for harvesting grain, a scythe for cutting hay, and various other tools that had been passed down through his family or traded for with other villagers. Each of these tools represented a significant investment and required its own specialized maintenance routine. The mattock, with its heavy iron head and sturdy wooden handle, was essential for preparing ground that was too rough or rocky for the plow. The head had to be kept sharp and properly attached to the handle, as a loose tool head could be dangerous to the user and ineffective for its intended purpose. The sickle, with its curved iron blade and wooden handle, was perhaps the most frequently used tool during harvest season. The blade had to be maintained at precisely the right angle to cut grain efficiently without getting caught in the stalks or requiring excessive force from the user. A dull sickle could slow the harvest dramatically and increase the risk of losing crops to bad weather. Thomas owned 2 sickles, one that he kept in prime condition for the crucial grain harvest, and another, older tool that he used for cutting weeds and other less critical tasks that might damage a good blade. The scythe was a more sophisticated tool that required considerable skill to use effectively. Its long, curved blade could cut a wide swath of grass or grain with each stroke, making it much more efficient than a sickle for certain types of work. However, the scythe's effectiveness depended on maintaining the proper balance between the blade and the long wooden handle, as well as keeping the cutting edge extremely sharp. Scythe blades were hammered thin at the cutting edge and required frequent peening, a process of hammering the metal to maintain the proper thinness and shape for cutting. The care and storage of these tools was as important as their use. Iron tools were susceptible to rust, especially in the damp climate of medieval England, so they had to be cleaned and dried carefully after use. A light coating of animal fat or oil could help protect iron surfaces from moisture, but this treatment had to be renewed regularly. Wooden handles were subject to cracking and splitting, particularly at the points where they joined iron tool heads. These joints were often reinforced with iron bands or wrapped with leather to prevent failure at critical moments. Tool storage presented its own challenges in the confined space of peasant cottages. Tools had to be kept dry and secure while remaining easily accessible when needed. Many families constructed simple tool sheds or lean-to structures attached to their cottages to provide protected storage for their most valuable implements. These storage areas had to be carefully designed to prevent theft while allowing air circulation to prevent moisture buildup that could damage both iron and wooden components. The seasonal cycle of tool use meant that different implements were needed at different times of year, allowing some tools to be stored for months at a time. Winter was often used for major tool maintenance projects, when time was available for tasks like replacing worn handles, sharpening blades, and making repairs that would ensure tools were ready for the coming agricultural season. Thomas spent many winter evenings working by firelight to maintain his precious collection of implements, passing on tool care skills to his son William as part of his agricultural education. The sharing of expensive tools among village families was a common practice that helped reduce individual costs while ensuring that specialized implements were available when needed. The ox-drawn harrow, used for covering seeds after planting, might be owned jointly by several families, with a schedule worked out to ensure each family could use it at the appropriate time. Heavy tools like stone boats for moving rocks or large ladders for roof repairs might be considered community property, maintained and used by whoever needed them. The manufacture of new tools when replacement became necessary was a complex process that involved multiple craftsmen and considerable expense. The village blacksmith could forge iron components, but he needed raw iron that had to be purchased from traveling merchants or produced in distant smelting operations. Wooden handles and other parts required skilled woodworkers who could select appropriate timber and shape it to the precise specifications needed for effective tool design. The coordination of these different specialists and the accumulation of necessary materials could take months or even years for complex tools. Tool innovation occurred slowly in medieval agriculture, as the conservative nature of peasant society discouraged experimentation that might risk crop failure. However, gradual improvements did occur over time as successful modifications were copied and passed on to other users. The addition of wheels to plows, improvements in iron working techniques, and refinements in tool design represented the accumulated wisdom of many generations of agricultural workers. Thomas and his contemporaries were both inheritors and contributors to this ongoing process of technological development. The Miller family, like all peasants in their village of Little Wickham, were bound to the land by the feudal system that governed medieval society. Thomas was what was known as a villain, not quite a slave, but not free either. He could not leave the manor without permission from his lord, Sir Edmund de Montfort, and he owed numerous obligations in return for the right to farm his strips of land in the village fields. These obligations included working on the lord's domain land for several days each week, paying rent in the form of grain or livestock, and performing various services such as repairing roads, maintaining ditches, and helping with the harvest on the lord's fields. The village of Little Wickham was home to about 40 families, all living in similar circumstances to the Millers. The village was laid out in a typical medieval pattern, with the lord's manor house and its associated buildings at one end, the parish church in the center, and the peasant cottages scattered around the edges. Between these main structures lay the village green, a common area where animals could graze and where the community gathered for festivals, markets, and important announcements. A small stream ran along the eastern edge of the village, providing water for animals and serving as a place where women could wash clothes on designated days of the week. The physical layout of the village reflected centuries of organic growth and practical necessity. The cottages were positioned to take advantage of natural drainage and protection from prevailing winds, while still maintaining easy access to the fields and common areas. Most cottages faced south to capture the maximum amount of sunlight during the short winter days, with their doors opening onto small yards where families could keep their animals and maintain kitchen gardens. The pathways connecting the various parts of the village were worn dirt tracks that became muddy quagmires during wet weather and dusty corridors during dry spells. The fields surrounding the village were divided into 3 large areas, worked according to the 3-field system that was common throughout medieval Europe. This agricultural system represented centuries of accumulated wisdom about sustainable farming practices, though the peasants who worked within it might not have understood the scientific principles that made it effective. One field would be planted with wheat or rye in the autumn for harvest the following summer. These winter grains were hardy crops that could survive freezing temperatures and provided the high-quality bread flour that was preferred when available. The autumn planting also made efficient use of labor, as it occurred after the main harvest was completed, but before winter weather made fieldwork impossible. Another field would be planted with oats, barley, or legumes in the spring for harvest in late summer. These spring crops included the oats that fed both humans and animals, barley for brewing ale and making porridge, and beans or peas that provided essential protein in the peasant diet. Legumes were particularly valuable because they actually improved the soil by adding nitrogen, though medieval farmers understood this only through observation of their effects rather than through scientific knowledge of the underlying processes. The timing of spring planting was critical, as seeds had to be sown after the danger of hard frost had passed, but early enough to allow the crops to mature before autumn rains could damage the harvest. The third field would lie fallow, allowing the soil to recover its fertility while serving other important purposes in the agricultural cycle. Fallow fields were not simply abandoned, they were carefully managed to maximize their benefits to the community. Animals were allowed to graze on the fallow land, and their manure provided natural fertilization that would benefit the following year's crops. Weeds that grew on fallow fields were cut for hay or animal feed, while some areas might be deliberately planted with fodder crops that would be plowed under to enrich the soil. The fallow year also provided an opportunity to make improvements to the field, clearing stones, repairing drainage ditches, or rebuilding the banks and boundaries that separated different holdings. The complexity of managing this 3-field system required extensive cooperation and coordination among all the families in the village. Decisions about when to plow, when to plant, and when to harvest had to be made collectively, taking into account weather conditions, the availability of draft animals, and the competing demands of different crops. The village reeve, elected from among the peasants themselves, played a crucial role in organizing this collective effort and ensuring that individual families fulfilled their obligations to the community and to their lord. The measurement and allocation of land within each field followed ancient customs that had been refined over generations of practice. Each peasant family held strips of land scattered throughout all 3 fields, ensuring that everyone had access to both good and poor soil, and that no single family would be completely ruined if one particular area suffered from natural disasters. The strips were typically 1 furrow long, the distance a team of oxen could plow before needing to rest, and were separated by narrow bands of unplowed land called bulks that served as boundaries and pathways. The division of these strips was governed by complex inheritance laws and rental agreements that had evolved over centuries. When a peasant died, his holdings were typically divided among his sons, according to local customs that varied from village to village. In some areas, the eldest son inherited the entire holding to keep it intact, while in others, the land was divided more equally among male heirs. Daughters usually received smaller portions or were provided with dowries in the form of household goods and livestock rather than land. These inheritance practices created a constantly changing pattern of landholding that required careful record-keeping and frequent adjustments to ensure that each family had adequate land to support themselves. The tools and techniques used to work these fields had been developed through centuries of agricultural experimentation and gradual improvement. The heavy plow that was essential for breaking the tough clay soils of medieval England was a sophisticated piece of technology that represented a significant advance over the simple scratch plows used in earlier periods. This plow featured a sharp iron plowshare that cut through the soil, a mold board that turned the earth over to bury weeds and crop residues, and a coulter that sliced vertically through the ground ahead of the plowshare. The entire implement was mounted on wheels and could be adjusted to control the depth and width of the furrow. Operating this plow required not only the expensive team of oxen, but also considerable skill and experience on the part of the plowmen. The animals had to be trained to work together smoothly, responding to voice commands and maintaining steady pressure against their yokes. The plowman had to judge the correct depth for each type of soil and crop, adjust the plow's settings to accommodate changing field conditions, and maintain a straight furrow that would provide optimal conditions for plant growth. A skilled plowman was highly valued in the village community, and his expertise was essential for successful crop production. Thomas's holdings in these fields consisted of several narrow strips scattered throughout all 3 fields. This arrangement, while seemingly inefficient, served several important purposes. It ensured that each peasant had access to both good and poor soil, and it meant that no single family would be completely ruined if one particular area of the fields suffered from drought, flooding, or disease. The strips were typically about an acre in size and were separated from each other by narrow boundaries called balks, which were marked by stones or left unplowed. On this particular morning in early spring, Thomas headed to his strips in what would be the oat field for the coming season. The previous year's crop had been harvested months ago, and the soil had been plowed in the autumn and again earlier this spring. Now came the time for planting the oats that would help sustain his family through the coming year. He carried a canvas bag filled with seed oats, carefully saved from the previous year's harvest. Every grain was precious. Too few seeds meant a poor harvest, but using too many meant less grain for eating during the hungry months before the new crop ripened. The work of planting was methodical and exhausting. Thomas walked slowly across each strip, broadcasting the seeds by hand in a practiced motion that ensured even coverage. This technique, known as broadcasting, required years of experience to master effectively. The seeds had to be thrown with just the right force and at precisely the right angle to achieve uniform distribution across the prepared ground. Too gentle a throw would leave seeds bunched near the planter's feet, while too vigorous a cast would scatter them beyond the boundaries of the strip and waste precious seed grain. The rhythm of broadcasting was crucial to maintaining consistent coverage across large areas. Thomas had developed a steady walking pace that synchronized with his throwing motion, ensuring that each handful of seeds was distributed over the proper amount of ground. He counted his steps and throws to maintain this rhythm, using techniques that his father had taught him and that he was now passing on to his son William. The successful broadcaster developed an intuitive sense of wind direction and strength, adjusting his throwing technique to compensate for air currents that might blow lightweight seeds off course. The preparation of the seed grain itself was a critical process that began months before planting time. The best grain from the previous year's harvest had to be carefully selected and stored under conditions that would preserve its viability while protecting it from moisture, insects, and rodents. Thomas examined each handful of seed grain before planting, removing any kernels that showed signs of damage, disease, or insect infestation. Damaged seeds not only failed to germinate, but could also introduce diseases or pests that would damage the entire crop. The storage of seed grain required special facilities and techniques to maintain quality over the long months between harvest and planting. Clay pots with tight-fitting lids were preferred for small quantities of the most valuable seeds, while larger amounts might be stored in wooden chests or specially constructed granaries. The storage containers had to be absolutely dry and sealed against moisture, as even small amounts of dampness could cause the grain to rot or sprout prematurely. Various substances were used to deter insects and rodents. Aromatic herbs, ash from certain types of wood, or even small amounts of sulfur when it was available. Temperature control was another important factor in seed storage. Grain stored in areas that experienced large temperature fluctuations was more likely to deteriorate than seed kept in consistently cool conditions. Many families constructed underground storage pits lined with stones or clay to provide stable temperatures and protection from extreme weather. These storage pits had to be carefully waterproofed and equipped with drainage systems to prevent water accumulation that could ruin entire stores of precious seed grain. The timing of seed preparation was carefully coordinated with planting schedules to ensure maximum viability. Seeds that were removed from storage too early might begin to deteriorate before they could be planted, while those kept in storage too long past their optimal planting time might lose their ability to germinate effectively. Thomas began preparing his oat seeds several days before the optimal planting conditions arrived. examining each batch carefully and making final selections based on the appearance and feel of individual kernels. Behind him, William followed with a harrow, a wooden frame fitted with iron spikes that would cover the seeds and protect them from birds. The harrow was a sophisticated piece of agricultural equipment that required careful construction and maintenance to be effective. The wooden frame had to be strong enough to withstand the stress of being dragged across rough ground, while remaining light enough to be pulled efficiently by the ox. The iron spikes or teeth had to be precisely spaced and angled to achieve the right depth of soil penetration without damaging the seeds that had been scattered on the surface. The operation of the harrow required considerable skill and experience to achieve optimal results. The depth of penetration had to be adjusted based on soil conditions. Too shallow, and the seeds would remain on the surface where they could be eaten by birds or blown away by wind. Too deep, and the seeds would be buried so far that they could not successfully germinate and emerge from the soil. William was still learning to judge these conditions, working under his father's careful supervision to develop the skills he would need when he eventually took over responsibility for the family's farming operations. The harrow was pulled by their ox, Brownie, a massive brown animal that was shared with 3 other families in the village. Brownie was a patient, well-trained animal who had learned to respond to voice commands and hand signals from his various handlers. The ox represented an enormous investment for the 4 families who owned him jointly. His purchase price, feeding costs, and veterinary care consumed resources that would have been impossible for any single peasant family to afford. The coordination required to share Brownie's services fairly among the 4 families required careful planning and mutual cooperation throughout the agricultural season. The care and management of the shared ox was a complex responsibility that rotated among the 4 families according to a schedule that had been negotiated and refined over many years. Each family was responsible for feeding and housing the animal during their assigned periods, ensuring that he remained healthy and strong enough to perform the heavy work required during critical agricultural seasons. This responsibility included not only providing adequate food and shelter, but also monitoring the animal's health and arranging for treatment when illness or injury occurred. The feeding of a working ox required substantial amounts of hay, grain, and other fodder that had to be planned for and accumulated throughout the year. During the growing season, Brownie could graze on fallow fields and common lands, supplementing his diet with grass and other vegetation. However, during the winter months when green fodder was unavailable, the ox had to be fed stored hay, grain, and other preserved feeds that represented a significant portion of each family's agricultural production. The quantity and quality of winter feed had a direct impact on the animal's condition and ability to perform heavy work during the following year's planting and plowing seasons. The training of oxen for agricultural work was a specialized skill that required patience, consistency, and deep understanding of animal behavior. Young oxen had to be gradually introduced to the yoke and taught to respond to the commands and signals used by their handlers. This training process could take months or even years to complete, during which time the animal was gradually introduced to increasingly heavy and complex tasks. A well-trained ox was enormously valuable, as his cooperation and responsiveness could make the difference between successful and unsuccessful completion of critical agricultural operations. The ox was too expensive for any single peasant family to own outright, so the four families had pooled their resources and shared the animal's services according to a complicated schedule that had been worked out over many years. This sharing arrangement required detailed planning and coordination to ensure that each family could use the ox when they needed him most. Priority was typically given to time-sensitive operations like plowing and planting, while less urgent tasks were scheduled around the availability of the animal. Conflicts over scheduling were resolved through negotiation and sometimes arbitration by village officials. The economic benefits of sharing expensive equipment like oxen extended beyond simple cost reduction. The arrangement allowed families to afford better quality animals than they could have purchased individually, while also spreading the risks associated with animal ownership. If the ox became sick or injured, the costs of treatment or replacement were shared among all four families, rather than falling entirely on a single household. This risk sharing was particularly important given the devastating impact that the loss of draft animals could have on peasant families' ability to work their land effectively. The legal and social aspects of joint animal ownership were governed by detailed agreements that specified each family's rights and responsibilities. These agreements covered feeding schedules, veterinary costs, breeding decisions, and eventual replacement of the animal when age or infirmity made continued use impractical. Disputes over the animal's care or use were typically resolved through the village court system, with decisions based on established precedents and community standards of fair dealing. The seasonal demands for ox labor created periods of intense competition for the animal services, requiring careful coordination and sometimes compromise among the sharing families. Spring plowing and planting created the highest demand, as timing was critical for successful crop establishment. Harvest time also generated competing demands, as families needed the ox's strength for hauling grain and other heavy materials. The sharing schedule had to balance these competing needs while ensuring that no family was consistently disadvantaged in their access to the animal's services. As they worked, other villagers were busy in their own strips nearby. The fields were alive with activity as families hurried to get their crops planted before the optimal planting season passed. Medieval farming operated on a narrow margin of error. Plant too early and a late frost could destroy the crop. Plant too late and the grain might not ripen before the autumn rains made harvest impossible. Every decision carried enormous consequences for the survival of the family. The social structure of the village was complex and governed by centuries of tradition and custom. At the top was Sir Edmund de Montfort, the lord of the manor, who lived in a stone manor house with his family and household. Sir Edmund was a knight who held the manor from a higher lord, who in turn held his lands from the king. Below the lord were the village officials who helped manage the day-to-day affairs of the community. The reeve was chosen from among the villeins to oversee fieldwork and collect rents. The hayward was responsible for maintaining boundaries and protecting crops from wandering animals. The ale taster ensured that beer brewed for sale met village standards, and the constable kept order and dealt with minor crimes and disputes. Thomas had served as Hayward for 2 years in his 20s, a position that brought both respect and responsibility. The role required him to patrol the fields regularly, checking for damaged boundaries, ensuring that animals were properly contained, and settling disputes between neighbors over everything from crop damage to water rights. It was unpaid work, performed as part of his obligations to the manor, but it had given him valuable experience in village governance and a deeper understanding of the complex web of rights and responsibilities that governed peasant life. The Miller family's daily routine varied with the seasons, but certain tasks remained constant throughout the year. Margaret's work centered around the cottage and its immediate surroundings. She was responsible for tending their small garden plot, where she grew vegetables that would supplement their grain-based diet. Onions, leeks, cabbages, and beans were staples, along with herbs for flavoring and medicine. She also maintained their ale supply, brewing fresh batches regularly, since ale was safer to drink than water and provided important nutrition for the family. Brewing ale was both a science and an art that Margaret had learned from her mother. The process began with malting barley, allowing it to sprout and then drying it to convert the starches into sugars. The malted barley was then mashed with hot water to extract the sugars, and the resulting liquid was boiled with herbs for flavoring and preservation. Hops were not yet commonly used in England, so Margaret used a mixture of herbs called groot, which might include bog myrtle, heather, or wild rosemary, depending on what was available locally. After cooling, yeast was added to begin fermentation, and within a week, the family had a fresh supply of mild ale that would keep them healthy and hydrated. The cottage itself required constant maintenance. The thatched roof needed regular repair, especially after storms when the wind might tear away sections of straw. The wattle and daub walls required periodic renewal, as the mud and clay mixture would crack and fall away over time. Inside the cottage, the hearth was the center of all domestic activity. Here, Margaret cooked the family's meals, heated water for washing, and provided the light by which they worked during the dark winter months. Cooking was done in iron pots suspended over the fire on iron chains, or in clay vessels that could be placed directly in the coals. The family owned several wooden bowls, horn spoons, and a few precious iron knives. Meals were simple but nourishing when ingredients were available. Pottage, a thick stew made from whatever vegetables and grains were on hand, was a daily staple. On special occasions, this might be enhanced with small pieces of bacon or salt pork. Bread, when they had enough grain to make it, was baked on a flat stone placed over the coals or in a clay oven that Thomas had built against one wall of the cottage. Water was drawn from the village well, located near the church at the center of the settlement. This was often Margaret's first task of the day, carrying wooden buckets to fill the large clay vessels that stored the family's water supply. The well was a gathering place for the village women, who would exchange news, gossip, and advice while waiting their turn at the windlass. These conversations were an important source of information about weather predictions to news from neighboring villages brought by traveling merchants or pilgrims. The church played a central role in village life, both spiritually and socially. Father Benedict, The village priest was one of the few literate people in Little Wickham, and he served not only as spiritual advisor, but also as keeper of records, mediator of disputes, and connection to the wider world beyond the village boundaries. Every Sunday, the entire village was expected to attend Mass, conducted in Latin that few could understand, but all found comforting in its familiar rhythms and rituals. The church building itself was a source of pride for the village. Built of local stone with a wooden roof, it was by far the largest and most impressive structure in Little Wickham. Inside, the walls were decorated with painted scenes from the Bible, serving as a visual Bible for the illiterate population. The church also housed the village's most precious possessions: silver vessels for the Mass, illuminated books, and relics of saints that were believed to provide protection for the community. Religious festivals punctuated the year and provided welcome breaks from the routine of daily labor. Christmas brought a brief respite from fieldwork and the rare treat of fresh meat when animals were slaughtered rather than fed through the winter months. Easter marked the end of the Lenten fast and the beginning of spring planting season. Harvest festivals in late summer celebrated the completion of the year's most crucial work and gave thanks for whatever bounty God had provided. These festivals were community affairs that brought together not just the villagers of Little Wickham, but often residents of neighboring settlements as well. They featured music, dancing, storytelling, and games that provided entertainment in a world where such diversions were rare. Young people often met their future spouses at these gatherings, and marriages were arranged that would bind families together across village boundaries. The cycle of agricultural work dominated the peasant year. Spring brought plowing and planting, tasks that required the cooperation of the entire community. The heavy plows needed teams of oxen to pull them, and these expensive animals were shared among multiple families. The timing of plowing was crucial. The soil had to be dry enough to work, but moist enough to break up properly. Too early, and the plow would stick in muddy earth. Too late, and the soil might be too hard to penetrate effectively. Summer meant constant vigilance over growing crops. Weeds had to be pulled by hand, a back-breaking task that fell to women and children as well as men. Birds and animals had to be kept away from ripening grain, leading to long days of standing guard in the fields with slings and noisemakers. The weather had to be watched constantly. Too much rain could rot the grain in the fields, while drought could shrivel the plants before they could produce a harvest. Harvest time in late summer was the most crucial period of the peasant year. The entire community mobilized for this effort, working from dawn to dusk to bring in the grain before weather or pests could destroy it. Every able-bodied person participated, from young children who gathered straw to elderly grandparents who helped with bundling and stacking. The work was exhausting, but also celebratory, as songs and stories helped pass the time and maintain morale during the long days. The harvest began with cutting the grain using sickles or scythes. The sickle was the more common tool, a curved blade attached to a short handle that allowed precise cutting of individual stalks. The scythe, with its long handle and larger blade, could cut more grain quickly, but required more skill to use effectively. Behind the cutters came others who gathered the cut grain into bundles called sheaves, which were then tied with straw bands and left in the fields to dry. Once dried, the sheaves were loaded onto carts and brought to the threshing floor, usually located near the Lord's barn. Here, the grain was beaten with flails, wooden clubs connected by leather thongs, to separate the grain from the straw. The grain and chaff were then winnowed, using the wind to blow away the lighter chaff while the heavier grain fell to the ground. This process was repeated until clean grain remained, ready to be stored for the coming year. The division of the harvest followed ancient customs that governed peasant obligations. The lord of the manor received his share first, typically 1/3 of the crop from each peasant holding. The church claimed its tithe, usually 1/10 of what remained. From what was left, the peasant family had to save seed for the following year's planting, pay rent to the Lord, and set aside grain to feed their animals through the winter. Only what remained after all these obligations were met belonged to the family for their own consumption. This system left little margin for error. A poor harvest could mean starvation, and even a good harvest might provide only enough food to last until the next year's crop ripened. The period from late spring to early summer, when the previous year's stores were running low but the new crop was not yet ready, was known as the hungry season. During these difficult months, families might be reduced to eating bread made from acorns, bark, or other desperate substitutes for grain. Thomas had lived through several such hungry seasons, and the memory of them influenced every decision he made about storing and using food. Every grain of wheat was precious, every egg from their chickens a valuable source of protein, every vegetable from Margaret's garden a contribution to their survival. Waste was not just economically foolish, it could be literally a matter of life and death. The daily routine of peasant life was structured around the needs of agricultural production, but it was also shaped by the social obligations that bound the community together. Thomas owed labor service to the lord of the manor, typically 3 days per week during busy seasons. This work might involve plowing the lord's domain fields, harvesting his crops, repairing his buildings, or maintaining the roads and bridges that connected the manor to the outside world. These labor obligations were a source of constant tension. Time spent working for the Lord was time not available for working on his own family's holdings. Yet failure to fulfill these obligations could result in fines, punishment, or even loss of his right to farm the land. Thomas had to carefully balance his own family's needs against his obligations to his Lord, always walking a fine line between survival and compliance with the feudal system that governed his life. The manor court met regularly to address disputes, assign obligations, and maintain the complex web of relationships that held the community together. Thomas attended these sessions as required, listening as the reeve read out the work assignments for the coming week, as neighbors brought complaints against each other, and as the Lord's steward announced new regulations or changes in customary practices. These courts were conducted in a mixture of English and Norman French, reflecting the social divisions that still marked English society more than 2 centuries after the Norman conquest. Legal disputes were common in peasant communities, often involving matters that might seem trivial to modern observers, but were crucial to medieval villagers. Arguments over field boundaries, damage caused by wandering animals, water rights, and inheritance disputes all required resolution. The manor court provided a forum for these discussions, guided by ancient custom and precedent rather than written law. Punishments were usually financial, fines that went to the Lord's treasury, though serious offenses might result in time in the stocks or even banishment from the village. Marriage and family relationships were governed by both church law and local custom. Thomas and Margaret had been married by Father Benedict after Thomas had obtained permission from the Lord and paid the required fine for the right to marry. Their marriage, like most peasant unions, was as much an economic arrangement as a romantic one. Margaret brought with her a small dowry consisting of household goods and a few animals, while Thomas offered the security of his land tenure and his skills as a farmer. The couple had been fortunate in having 3 children who survived infancy, though they had also lost 2 babies in their first year of life. Child mortality was tragically common in medieval times, with perhaps half of all children dying before reaching adulthood. Disease, malnutrition, and accidents claimed young lives with heartbreaking regularity, making every healthy child a precious gift to be protected and cherished. William, as the eldest son, was being prepared to take over his father's responsibilities when the time came. From an early age, he had accompanied Thomas to the fields, learning the skills and knowledge that would enable him to support his own family someday. He could already handle a plow, though he still needed help managing the oxen. He knew when to plant different crops, how to recognize signs of plant disease, and how to maintain the tools that were essential to agricultural work. Mary and Anne would likely marry young and move to their husbands' villages, taking with them the skills that Margaret was teaching them. They learned to spin wool into thread, to weave cloth on the simple loom that occupied one corner of their cottage, to brew ale, to tend chickens, and to prepare the various foods that sustained peasant families. These skills would make them valuable wives and ensure their own survival in a world where women's economic contributions were essential to family success. Education, in any formal sense, was not available to peasant children. The few schools that existed served the children of merchants and nobles, and even basic literacy was rare among the common people. However, peasant children received a different kind of education. Practical training in the skills they would need to survive and prosper in their adult lives. They learned by observation and participation, gradually taking on more responsibility as they grew older and stronger. The changing seasons brought different challenges and opportunities to peasant life. Winter was a time of relative rest from fieldwork, but it brought its own hardships. The short days and long nights had to be filled with indoor work, repairing tools, mending clothes, and maintaining equipment for the coming year. Food stores had to be carefully managed to last through the cold months, and fuel for heating had to be gathered and conserved. The cottage was difficult to keep warm during the harsh English winters. The central hearth provided some heat, but much of it escaped through the smoke hole in the roof. The family often slept together in the warmest part of the cottage, sharing body heat and blankets made from wool and linen. On the coldest nights, they might even bring their smaller animals indoors, both to protect them from the cold and to benefit from the warmth of their bodies. Spring brought renewed hope and activity as the agricultural cycle began again. The first warm days meant that fieldwork could resume, that animals could be turned out to pasture, and that the garden could be prepared for planting vegetables. It was also a time of anxiety, as winter food stores ran low and the new harvest was still months away. Wild plants gathered from the forests and fields helped supplement the diet. Nettles for soup, wild onions for flavoring, and various herbs for both food and medicine. Summer was the busiest season, with crops requiring constant attention and the long days allowing maximum work time. It was also the most hopeful season, as growing crops promised relief from the hunger and hardship of winter and spring. The weather was closely watched for signs of the storms that could flatten grain or the droughts that could wither young plants. Every sunny day was a gift that brought the harvest closer, while every rainy week raised fears of crop failure and starvation. Autumn brought the culmination of the year's work in the form of harvest, followed by the preparations necessary to survive another winter. Animals that could not be fed through the cold months were slaughtered, and their meat was preserved by salting or smoking. Gardens were harvested, and vegetables were stored in root cellars or preserved by drying. The community came together for the hard work of threshing grain and preparing it for storage in carefully sealed containers that would protect it from moisture and vermin. The peasant diet was monotonous by modern standards, but was reasonably nutritious when food was available. Grain formed the foundation of every meal, whether as bread, porridge, or ale. Vegetables from the garden provided vitamins and minerals, while dairy products supplied protein and fat when the cow was producing milk. Meat was a rare treat, consumed mainly during religious festivals or when an animal died or was slaughtered. Fish might be available from streams or ponds, and eggs provided protein when the chickens were laying. Cooking was done entirely over an open fire, which limited the types of dishes that could be prepared. Boiling was the most common cooking method, producing the stews and porridges that formed the basis of most meals. Roasting was possible for small pieces of meat or fish, while baking required the specialized clay oven that not all families possessed. Food preservation was crucial for survival, accomplished through drying, salting, smoking, or fermentation. Cheese made from surplus milk could last for months, while salted pork could provide protein through the winter. The isolation of peasant life was profound by modern standards. Most villagers never traveled more than a few miles from their birthplace during their entire lives. News from the outside world came through traveling merchants, pilgrims, or the occasional messenger carrying official communications to the lord of the manor. Wars might rage in distant parts of the kingdom without directly affecting village life, though taxes and military levies could impact the community even when the fighting never came near. This isolation bred a strong sense of community among villagers who depended on each other for survival and support. Neighbors helped each other during times of crisis, shared tools and animals, and provided the social connections that made life bearable in difficult circumstances. Community celebrations marked the passage of the seasons and provided opportunities for young people to meet, for families to strengthen their bonds, and for the village as a whole to reinforce its shared identity. Religion provided comfort and meaning in a life that was often harsh and uncertain. The Catholic Church offered explanations for suffering and promises of reward in the afterlife for those who bore their earthly burdens with patience and faith. Saints were believed to provide protection and intercession, while religious rituals marked the important transitions of life: birth, marriage, and death. The church building served as a refuge during times of danger and a gathering place for community events. Thomas had been born into this life and expected nothing different for his children. The social mobility that would characterize later centuries was virtually unknown in medieval times. A peasant's son might become a craftsman, or even a priest if he showed exceptional ability and received patronage, but most children could expect to follow in their parents' footsteps. This stability provided security and continuity, but also meant that improvement in living conditions was slow and incremental. The tools and techniques of medieval agriculture had remained largely unchanged for centuries. The heavy plow that Thomas used was similar to those employed by his great-grandfather, and the methods of planting, cultivating, and harvesting crops followed patterns established in ancient times. Innovation was discouraged by both custom and necessity. Experimentation with new methods risked crop failure and starvation, making conservative approaches the safest choice for survival. Yet within this seemingly static system, small changes did occur over time. New crops might be introduced gradually, better tools might be developed through incremental improvements, and more efficient methods of organizing work might evolve through trial and error. The three-field system itself had been an innovation that increased agricultural productivity compared to earlier methods, though it too would eventually be superseded by more advanced techniques. Disease was a constant threat to both humans and animals in medieval times. The bubonic plague, which would devastate Europe in the 14th century, was still in the future, but many other diseases took their toll on peasant communities. Tuberculosis, pneumonia, dysentery, and various fevers claimed lives regularly, while malnutrition weakened immune systems and made people more susceptible to illness. Medical care consisted mainly of herbal remedies and folk treatments, with trained physicians available only to the wealthy. Margaret served as the family's healer, using knowledge passed down from her mother and grandmother to treat common ailments with herbs gathered from the fields and forests. Willow bark could reduce fever and pain, while various plants were believed to help with digestive problems, wounds, and respiratory ailments. Much of this folk medicine was based on centuries of observation and experimentation, though it was mixed with superstition and religious beliefs about the causes and cures of disease. The role of women in peasant society was crucial but circumscribed. Margaret's work was as essential to family survival as Thomas's, but it was concentrated in and around the home rather than in the broader fields that defined male agricultural work. She had some legal rights. She could inherit property, make contracts, and appear in court, but these rights were limited by her status as a woman and a peasant. Her identity was largely defined by her relationships to the men in her life. First her father, then her husband, and eventually her sons. Despite these limitations, women like Margaret wielded considerable influence within their communities. They controlled important aspects of family life, managed household resources, and maintained the social networks that bound villages together. Their knowledge of childcare, food preparation, textile production, and medical treatment made them indispensable to family and community survival. The informal power they exercised through these roles often compensated for their formal legal and social subordination. The children's lives were shaped by the need to contribute to family survival from an early age. William had been helping with farm work since he could walk, gradually taking on more responsibility as he grew stronger and more skilled. Mary and Anne helped their mother with household tasks, learned to care for younger children, and began acquiring the skills they would need as wives and mothers. Play was limited and usually took forms that prepared children for their adult responsibilities. Childhood as a separate and protected stage of life was not recognized in medieval peasant society. Children were viewed as small adults who needed to learn quickly how to contribute to family welfare. They wore smaller versions of adult clothing, participated in adult conversations and decisions as their maturity allowed, and were expected to behave with a seriousness that might seem precocious by modern standards. Yet within these constraints, children still found ways to enjoy their youth through games, stories, and the small freedoms that adult supervision allowed. The daily routine that governed the Miller family's life was replicated, with variations, throughout peasant Europe. The specific crops might differ based on climate and soil. The particular obligations to lords might vary according to local customs, and the details of housing and diet might reflect regional traditions, but the basic patterns of life were remarkably similar across the continent. This uniformity reflected the common challenges of agricultural survival and the shared cultural heritage of Christian European civilization. Thomas understood his place in this larger world, though his knowledge of it came mainly through stories told by travelers and the teachings of the church. He knew that his king ruled over many lords like Sir Edmund, and that his lord owed service to greater nobles, creating a chain of obligation that stretched from the humblest peasant to the royal court. He knew that other kingdoms existed beyond England's borders, and that the Pope in Rome held authority over all Christian souls, including his own. This knowledge gave Thomas a sense of belonging to something larger than his village, even though he would never see the king's court or the holy city of Rome. His daily prayers included petitions for the king's health and the pope's wisdom, linking his small concerns to the great affairs of church and state. His taxes and labor service connected him to the military campaigns and administrative needs of the kingdom, making him a participant in historical events even when he never learned their outcomes. The passage of time in peasant life was marked not by calendars and clocks, which were rare and expensive, but by the natural rhythms of day and night, the phases of the moon, and the changing seasons. The church bell marked the hours of prayer and called the community together for worship, while the position of the sun indicated the time for different daily activities. Years were remembered not by numbers, but by significant events. The year of the Great Flood, the year the harvest failed, the year Sir Edmund's son was born. This cyclical understanding of time reflected the repetitive nature of agricultural life, where the same tasks returned year after year in predictable patterns. Yet within these cycles, each season brought its own challenges and uncertainties. The weather could never be completely predicted, Crops might fail despite careful tending, and disease could strike without warning. These uncertainties made peasants deeply religious, constantly seeking divine protection and intervention in their daily struggles. As Thomas worked in his fields on this spring morning, broadcasting oat seeds with the practiced motion of decades, he was participating in a drama of survival that had been enacted for countless generations before him and would continue for generations to come. His movements were efficient and economical, conserving energy for the long day ahead while ensuring that every seed had the best possible chance of germinating and producing grain. The social interactions that punctuated his workday were as important as the physical labor itself. A conversation with a neighbor about the weather might reveal useful information about planting conditions. A discussion about a sick animal could lead to helpful advice or an offer of assistance. The sharing of tools, animals, and labor created bonds of mutual obligation that strengthened the entire community's ability to survive and prosper. The complexity of these social relationships was revealed in countless small ways throughout the day. When Thomas borrowed a harrow from his neighbor Robert, he was not simply using a tool. He was acknowledging a debt that would need to be repaid through future favors or assistance. When he helped young Peter repair a broken plow, he was investing in the community's collective welfare while also fulfilling the moral obligations that bound neighbors together. These exchanges created a dense network of reciprocal relationships that made individual survival possible in a harsh and uncertain world. The manor court records, kept on parchment rolls by a clerk who could read and write, documented some of these relationships in their dry legal language. Debts owed and paid, disputes settled and punishments assessed, obligations assigned and fulfilled, all were recorded in the careful script that preserved the official memory of the community. But the full richness of peasant life existed in the unrecorded interactions, the casual conversations, the shared meals, and the mutual support that neighbors provided to each other without formal documentation. Thomas's relationship with his lord, Sir Edmund de Montfort, was both distant and intimate. He rarely saw the lord directly, dealing instead with the reeve, the bailiff, and other officials who managed the day-to-day operations of the manor. Yet Sir Edmund's presence was felt in every aspect of Thomas's life, in the work obligations that structured his week, in the rent payments that claimed a portion of his harvest, and in the legal authority that governed his movements and decisions. The Lord's manor house stood as a visible symbol of this authority, its stone walls and tall windows a stark contrast to the humble wattle and daub cottages of the peasants. Inside, Sir Edmund lived with his family in comfort that Thomas could barely imagine. Multiple rooms, glass windows, fine furniture, and servants to attend to their needs. The Lord's table featured meat at every meal, wine imported from distant lands, and spices that cost more than a peasant family's annual income. Yet even Sir Edmund was bound by the same feudal obligations that constrained Thomas, owing service and loyalty to his own superior lords in an unbroken chain that led ultimately to the king. The steward who managed Sir Edmund's estates was a figure of considerable authority in the village. Master Geoffrey was literate, numerate, and experienced in the complex business of running a medieval manor. He kept careful records of grain production, labor obligations, and rent payments, ensuring that the Lord received his full due from the peasant families under his authority. Thomas had learned to approach Master Geoffrey with a mixture of respect and caution, knowing that the steward's decisions could significantly impact his family's welfare. The relationship between lord and peasant was theoretically based on mutual obligation. The lord provided protection and justice in return for labor and rent from his peasants. In practice, this relationship was heavily weighted in favor of the lord, who had both legal authority and physical force to compel obedience. The lord's soldiers, though few in number, represented a military power that individual peasants could not hope to resist. Yet the system also imposed real obligations on the lord, who was expected to provide leadership in times of crisis and to ensure that justice was available to resolve disputes among his tenants. The seasonal rhythm of agricultural work created periods of intense activity, alternating with times of relative rest. During planting and harvest seasons, every daylight hour was precious, and families worked together with desperate urgency to complete the tasks that would determine their survival through the coming year. These periods brought the community together in shared effort, as neighbors helped each other and social distinctions temporarily blurred in the face of common necessity. The harvest season was particularly intense, requiring the mobilization of every available person in the village. Children too young for heavy labor served as runners and messengers, carrying water to the workers and keeping birds away from the grain. Women worked alongside men in the fields, their usual domestic duties temporarily set aside for the more urgent task of bringing in the crops. Even elderly villagers contributed what they could, whether by preparing meals for the workers or by watching the youngest children while their parents labored in the fields. The tools used for harvest had been developed over centuries of agricultural experience. The sickle, with its curved blade and short handle, allowed precise cutting of grain stalks without wasting any of the precious crop. The scythe, though more difficult to master, could clear larger areas more quickly and was preferred for cutting hay and grass. The flail used for threshing consisted of two wooden pieces connected by leather, allowing grain to be beaten from the stalks without crushing the kernels. Each tool required skill to use effectively and careful maintenance to keep it in working condition. The storage of grain after harvest was a critical concern that could determine whether a family survived the winter or faced starvation. Thomas and his neighbors used a combination of methods to protect their precious stores from moisture, vermin, and theft. Clay pots with tight-fitting lids kept smaller quantities of grain dry and secure. Larger amounts were stored in wooden chests or bins, often raised off the ground to prevent damage from flooding. The most important grain might be kept in the cottage itself, where it could be guarded constantly and accessed easily during the winter months. Vermin control was a constant battle that required vigilance and ingenuity. Rats and mice could destroy significant quantities of stored grain, while insects could render entire stores inedible. Cats were valued members of peasant households for their ability to control rodent populations, and various herbs and substances were used to deter insects. The grain itself had to be checked regularly and turned periodically to prevent spoilage and to identify problems before they could spread. The preservation of other foods required different techniques adapted to the specific characteristics of each type of food. Meat was preserved through salting, smoking, or a combination of both methods. The family pig, slaughtered in late autumn, would be carefully butchered with every part used for some purpose. The meat was cut into pieces and packed in salt to draw out moisture and prevent decay. Some portions were hung in the smoky atmosphere above the hearth, where the constant exposure to smoke would further preserve them and add flavor. Even the blood was saved and made into sausages, while the intestines served as casings, and the fat was rendered for cooking and preservation. Dairy products presented their own preservation challenges. Fresh milk was consumed quickly or made into cheese, which could be stored for extended periods if properly prepared. Margaret had learned the cheese-making process from her mother, understanding the delicate balance of temperature, timing, and ingredients that determined whether the final product would be edible or spoiled. The process began with allowing milk to sour naturally or adding rennet to cause it to curdle. The curds were then separated from the whey, pressed to remove excess moisture, and aged in cool, dry conditions. Different types of cheese resulted from variations in this basic process, each with its own keeping qualities and nutritional characteristics. Vegetables from the garden were preserved through a variety of methods depending on their nature and the facilities available. Root vegetables like turnips and carrots could be stored in root cellars or buried in sand to keep them fresh through the winter. Leafy vegetables were often dried and stored in baskets or bags, though this process reduced their nutritional value and changed their texture significantly. Some vegetables were pickled in vinegar or salt brine, creating preserved foods that could last for months while retaining much of their nutritional content. The preparation of these preserved foods during the winter months required skill and creativity to make them palatable and nutritious. Salted meat had to be soaked to remove excess salt before cooking, while dried vegetables needed to be rehydrated carefully to restore their texture. The limited variety of preserved foods meant that winter meals tended to be monotonous, consisting mainly of variations on stews and porridges that combined whatever ingredients were available. Spices and herbs were precious additions that could transform these basic dishes into more appealing meals, but they were expensive and had to be used sparingly. The daily preparation of meals was complicated by the limitations of cooking over an open fire and the need to conserve fuel. Wood for burning had to be gathered regularly, and every stick was precious during the long winter months when dead wood became scarce and green wood burned poorly. Margaret had learned to manage her fire carefully, banking coals to maintain heat while using the minimum amount of fuel and timing her cooking to make the most efficient use of the heat generated. The eternal pot of pottage that simmered over the fire provided a base to which new ingredients could be added as they became available, creating a continuous cycle of meals that evolved but never completely ended. Water management was another crucial aspect of peasant life that required constant attention and careful planning. The village well provided relatively clean water, but it was located some distance from most cottages and required daily trips to maintain the household supply. Water had to be carried in wooden buckets or clay vessels, and the physical effort required meant that every drop was precious and none could be wasted. Rainwater was collected when possible, using simple gutters and containers to capture the runoff from thatched roofs. This water was particularly valued for washing clothes and bathing, as it was naturally soft and free from the minerals that made well water less suitable for these purposes. The washing of clothes and household items was a laborious process that typically occurred only when absolutely necessary. Soap was expensive and difficult to obtain, so most washing was done with hot water alone or with the addition of ash water, which provided some cleansing properties due to its alkaline nature. Clothes were beaten against rocks or scrubbed with brushes made from twigs and fibers to remove dirt and stains. The process was hard on fabric, and garments had to be carefully maintained and patched to extend their useful life as long as possible. Personal hygiene was limited by the scarcity of warm water, soap, and privacy. Most peasants bathed infrequently, perhaps once a week or less often during the winter months when heating water required precious fuel. Washing was usually done with cold water and focused on the hands, face, and other exposed areas that collected the most dirt. Teeth were cleaned with twigs or cloth, and breath was freshened with herbs when available. Hair was washed occasionally and kept clean through regular brushing and combing, though lice and other parasites were common problems that required constant vigilance and treatment. The production of textiles was an important household industry that occupied much of Margaret's time during the winter months when outdoor work was impossible. The family's sheep provided wool that had to be cleaned, carded, spun into thread, and woven into cloth. This process began with shearing the sheep in late spring, using iron shears to carefully remove the wool fleece without harming the animal. The raw wool was then washed repeatedly to remove dirt, oils, and other impurities that would interfere with the spinning and dyeing processes. Carding the wool involved combing it with special brushes fitted with metal teeth to align the fibers and remove any remaining debris. This prepared wool was then ready for spinning, a process that transformed the loose fibers into continuous thread through the use of a spinning wheel or hand spindle. Spinning required considerable skill to produce thread of consistent thickness and strength, and it was work that could be done while supervising children or performing other household tasks. The resulting thread was wound onto bobbins or spools, ready for the weaving process that would transform it into useful cloth. Weaving was accomplished on a simple loom that could be set up in the cottage during the winter months. The loom consisted of a wooden frame that held parallel threads called the warp under tension, while the weft threads were woven through them at right angles to create the fabric. Different patterns could be created by varying the way the weft threads were passed over and under the warp threads, though most peasant weaving was simple and functional rather than decorative. The finished cloth was then fulled by beating and washing it to tighten the weave and create a more durable fabric. Dyeing the cloth required knowledge of local plants and minerals that could provide color, as well as mordants that would help the dyes bind permanently to the fibers. Different colors required different materials. Red might come from madder root, yellow from weld or onion skins, blue from woad, and brown from oak bark or walnut hulls. The dyeing process was complex and time-consuming, involving careful preparation of both the dye bath and the fabric to ensure even coloration and permanent results. Most peasant clothing was dyed brown or other earth tones that were relatively easy to achieve and practical for hiding dirt and stains. The finished cloth was then cut and sewn into garments using patterns that had been passed down through generations. Peasant clothing was designed for durability and practicality rather than fashion, with simple shapes that made efficient use of the available fabric. Men's tunics were essentially long shirts that reached to the knees, while women's dresses were longer and often included additional fabric for ease of movement during work. Children's clothes were usually smaller versions of adult garments, though they might be made from scraps and remnants to avoid wasting good cloth. The repair and maintenance of clothing was an ongoing necessity that required skill and creativity. Holes were patched with pieces of similar fabric when available, or with whatever material could be found when nothing else was suitable. Tears were mended with careful stitching, and worn areas were reinforced before they could develop into larger problems. Garments were altered as bodies changed size, with women's dresses let out or taken in to accommodate pregnancy and weight changes, and children's clothes adjusted as they grew or passed down to younger siblings. The changing seasons brought different challenges to textile production and clothing maintenance. Summer was the time for shearing sheep and gathering plants for dyes, while autumn was used for intensive spinning and weaving to prepare for the long winter months when most textile work would be done. Winter provided the time needed for the slow processes of spinning, weaving, and sewing, though the dim light and cold conditions made this work difficult and eye-straining. Spring brought the opportunity to wash and air clothes that had been worn continuously through the winter, removing the accumulated dirt and odors of months of heavy use. The social aspects of textile work provided important opportunities for women to gather together and share news, advice, and companionship. Spinning bees brought together groups of women who could work on their individual projects while enjoying conversation and mutual support. These gatherings served multiple purposes. They made the monotonous work of spinning more enjoyable. They provided opportunities for young women to learn from their elders, and they strengthened the social bonds that held the community together during difficult times. The knowledge required for successful textile production was extensive and specialized, encompassing understanding of animal husbandry, plant identification, chemistry, and engineering, as well as the manual skills needed for each step of the process. This knowledge was passed down from mother to daughter through years of observation and practice, creating a tradition of expertise that was essential to family survival. A woman who could produce high-quality cloth had a valuable skill that could provide additional income for her family and enhance her status within the community. The economic value of textile production extended beyond the family's immediate needs, as surplus cloth could be traded for other goods or sold for cash that could purchase items the family could not produce themselves. The weekly market in the nearest town provided an outlet for peasant-produced textiles, though the competition from professional weavers and the limited purchasing power of most customers meant that prices were usually low. Nevertheless, the income from textile sales could make the difference between prosperity and poverty for many peasant families. The tools and equipment needed for textile production represented a significant investment for peasant families, though most items were made locally and could be maintained and repaired by village craftsmen. Spinning wheels were complex mechanisms that required skill to operate and maintain, while looms were substantial pieces of equipment that occupied considerable space in the small peasant cottages. Carding brushes, shuttles, bobbins, and other specialized tools were all necessary for efficient production, and their care and maintenance was as important as the skills needed to use them effectively. The integration of textile production into the daily routine of peasant life required careful planning and organization. Work had to be scheduled around the seasonal demands of agriculture, with the most labor-intensive tasks reserved for periods when fieldwork was impossible. The different stages of production had to be coordinated so that raw materials were processed in time to meet the family's needs for finished products. Storage space had to be allocated for raw wool, spun thread, finished cloth, and the various tools and supplies needed for production. The quality of peasant-produced textiles varied considerably depending on the skill of the producer, the quality of the raw materials, and the time available for careful work. The best peasant cloth was sturdy and serviceable, though it lacked the fine finish and consistent quality of cloth produced by professional weavers in the towns. However, for the everyday needs of peasant families, this homemade cloth was perfectly adequate and had the advantage of being available without the expense of purchasing manufactured goods. As the seasons progressed through Thomas's life, each year brought its own particular challenges and opportunities. Some years were blessed with perfect weather that produced abundant harvests and allowed families to build up their reserves of food and other necessities. Other years brought disasters, floods that drowned the crops in the fields, droughts that withered plants before they could produce grain, or diseases that killed livestock and reduced families to desperate poverty. These variations in fortune were accepted as part of God's plan, though they were also prepared for through careful planning and community mutual aid. The memory of past disasters served as a guide for current decisions, with families striving to maintain reserves that could carry them through periods of hardship. The Great Famine that had occurred when Thomas was a young man remained vivid in his memory, a time when even the wealthiest peasant families had struggled to find enough food to survive. Children had died from starvation, adults had been reduced to eating grass and bark, and the social order had nearly collapsed under the pressure of universal want. That experience had taught Thomas the importance of careful planning, conservative resource management, and strong community bonds. The role of the church in providing both spiritual and material support during times of crisis was crucial to peasant survival. Father Benedict not only offered prayers and religious comfort, but also organized relief efforts that could mean the difference between life and death for struggling families. The church's resources, its stores of grain, its connections to wealthy patrons, and its moral authority to command charity from those who had more than they needed, were mobilized during emergencies to help the most desperate members of the community. The monastery, located several miles from Little Wickham, also played an important role in the economic and spiritual life of the region. The monks who lived there had taken vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, dedicating their lives to prayer and service. However, the monastery as an institution was wealthy,
owning extensive lands that were worked by peasants similar to Thomas.
The monks provided various services to the surrounding communities, including medical care, education for those few who could afford it, and hospitality for travelers. Their library contained books that preserved knowledge from classical antiquity and the early Christian period, making the monastery a center of learning in a largely illiterate world. The relationship between the monastery and the peasant communities was complex, combining spiritual authority with economic power in ways that could benefit or burden ordinary families. The monks' prayers were believed to provide protection for the entire region, and their intercession was sought during times of particular danger or need. At the same time, the monastery's economic interests sometimes conflicted with those of the peasants, particularly when it came to the collection of tithes and rents from church lands. The broader political context of peasant life was largely invisible to families like the Millers, though its effects were felt through taxes, military levies, and the various disruptions caused by conflicts between noble families or kingdoms. Wars might be fought within a day's journey of Little Wickham without the villagers directly participating, or even knowing the outcomes until long after the fighting had ended. However, the consequences of these conflicts, increased taxes to pay for military campaigns, demands for men to serve in armies, or the disruption of trade that made certain goods scarce or expensive, could significantly impact peasant life. The Black Death, which would soon sweep across Europe and kill perhaps 1/3 of the population, was still in the future during Thomas's lifetime, but other diseases regularly claimed lives and disrupted communities. Influenza, tuberculosis, dysentery, and various fevers were common killers that could not be effectively treated with medieval medical knowledge. Epidemic diseases sometimes spread through entire regions, leaving some villages nearly empty and forcing survivors to abandon their homes and seek new lives elsewhere. The response to disease was a mixture of practical precautions, folk remedies, and religious devotion. Families isolated sick members when possible, though the small size of peasant cottages made this difficult. Herbal treatments were applied based on traditional knowledge, though their effectiveness was limited. Prayer and religious rituals were seen as the most important responses to serious illness, with the belief that disease was often a punishment for sin or a test of faith that could be overcome through proper spiritual devotion. The care of the elderly and infirm fell primarily to their families, as there were no institutions or public support systems for those who could no longer work. Adult children were expected to care for aging parents, providing them with food, shelter, and basic medical attention as long as they lived. This obligation was both a moral duty and a practical necessity, as the elderly often possessed valuable knowledge and skills that were needed for family survival. Grandparents might be too frail for heavy field work, but they could still contribute by watching children, preparing food, maintaining household equipment, and passing on the accumulated wisdom of their years. The death of family members was a frequent occurrence that peasant families had to accept and adapt to as part of the normal rhythm of life. High rates of infant and child mortality meant that most families lost at least some children before they reached adulthood. The death of adults in their prime working years could be catastrophic for the survivors, particularly if the deceased was the primary breadwinner or possessed specialized skills that were difficult to replace. Widows and orphans were particularly vulnerable, often depending on the charity of relatives and neighbors for their survival. Funeral practices were simple but important rituals that helped communities cope with loss and maintain social bonds. The body was prepared for burial by family members, wrapped in a simple shroud made from linen or wool cloth. A brief service conducted by the priest honored the deceased and commended their soul to God's mercy. Burial took place in the churchyard, in graves that were marked only by simple wooden crosses or stones. The entire community typically attended funerals, both as a mark of respect for the deceased and as a demonstration of solidarity with the surviving family members. The inheritance of property and possessions followed customary laws that varied from region to region, but generally favored male heirs and eldest sons. Thomas's land tenure would pass to William upon his death, along with the cottage, tools, and other possessions that were essential for agricultural work. Daughters typically received smaller inheritances consisting of household goods, clothing, and perhaps a few animals that would serve as their dowries when they married. These inheritance practices ensured that agricultural holdings remained intact and capable of supporting families, but they also created inequalities between siblings that could lead to conflicts and resentments. The legal status of peasants was complex and varied according to local customs and the specific terms under which they held their land. Most peasants were villains, bound to the land and unable to leave without their lord's permission. However, within this broad category, there were many gradations of freedom and obligation. Some villains held their land by relatively secure tenure that could be passed down to their heirs, while others were more vulnerable to eviction or changes in the terms of their tenancy. A few peasants were actually free farmers who owned their land outright, though they were still subject to various taxes and obligations to higher authorities. The manor court system provided a forum for resolving disputes and enforcing the complex web of obligations that governed peasant life. These courts met regularly, presided over by the lord's steward or reeve, and addressed issues ranging from minor property disputes to serious crimes. The procedures followed ancient customs rather than written law, with decisions based on precedent and community standards rather than formal legal codes. Punishments were usually fines paid to the lord, though serious offenses might result in physical punishment or banishment from the village. The administration of justice at the local level required peasants to participate in various ways, serving as jurors, witnesses, and accusers in the cases that came before the manor court. This participation gave ordinary villagers some voice in the legal processes that governed their lives, though the ultimate authority remained with the lord and his representatives. The system also provided a mechanism for peaceful resolution of conflicts that might otherwise lead to violence and disruption of community life. The economic relationships between peasants and their lords were governed by agreements that had been established over generations and were considered binding on both parties. Lords could not arbitrarily change the terms of peasant tenures or impose new obligations without justification based on custom and precedent. At the same time, peasants could not simply refuse to fulfill their established duties without facing legal consequences. This system provided a degree of stability and predictability, though it also limited opportunities for improvement or change in the conditions of peasant life. The gradual changes that were occurring in medieval society during Thomas's lifetime were largely invisible to him, though their effects would eventually transform the world his children would inherit. The growth of towns and trade was creating new opportunities for some peasants to escape agricultural life and pursue careers as craftsmen or merchants. The increasing use of money rather than barter was making economic relationships more flexible, but also more complex. The development of new agricultural techniques and the clearing of additional land for farming were slowly increasing productivity and supporting larger populations. These changes were proceeding slowly and unevenly, with some regions and communities experiencing significant transformations, while others remained largely unchanged. The conservative nature of peasant society and the powerful interests vested in maintaining traditional relationships meant that innovations were often resisted or adopted only gradually. Nevertheless, the accumulated effect of many small changes was beginning to alter the fundamental structures of medieval life, though the full implications of these transformations would not become apparent for several more generations. The daily life that Thomas and his family lived was both unique to their specific circumstances and representative of the experiences of millions of peasant families throughout medieval Europe. Their struggles with weather, disease, and economic hardship were shared by their contemporaries, as were their strategies for survival and their sources of meaning and satisfaction. The particular details of their village, their lord, and their regional customs gave distinctive characteristics to their lives, but the fundamental patterns of agricultural work, family relationships, and community obligations were remarkably similar across vast areas of the medieval world. As evening approached on this spring day that we have followed through Thomas's life, the family gathered around their hearth for their evening meal and the brief period of rest that preceded sleep. The day's work had been productive. Seeds had been planted, animals had been tended, and the various tasks of household maintenance had been completed. Tomorrow would bring similar challenges and similar satisfactions as the eternal cycle of agricultural life continued its ancient rhythm. Margaret served a simple meal of barley porridge flavored with leeks from their garden and a small amount of salt. The children shared a wooden bowl, taking turns with the single spoon that was their only eating utensil besides their knives. Thomas and Margaret ate from their own bowls, discussing quietly the events of the day and the plans for tomorrow's work. The conversation was punctuated by the crackling of the fire and the settling sounds of their small cottage as the wooden beams and thatched roof adjusted to the cooling evening air. Before sleep, the family joined together in the prayers that ended each day, thanking God for His protection and asking for blessings on their work and their community. These prayers were simple but heartfelt, reflecting the deep religious faith that sustained peasant families through the uncertainties and hardships of medieval life. The words were familiar from countless repetitions, passed down from parents to children as part of the cultural inheritance that shaped peasant identity and values. The cottage gradually grew quiet as the family settled onto their straw mattresses, pulling wool blankets around themselves for warmth. Outside, the village was similarly settling into the peaceful routine of evening, with only the occasional sound of an animal or the distant call of a night bird breaking the stillness. The spring air carried the sense of growing things and the promise of the harvest season still months away, reminding even sleeping peasants of the cycles of work and rest that governed their existence. In the darkness, Thomas lay awake for a few minutes, reviewing the day's accomplishments and considering the tasks that awaited him in the morning. His mind moved through the familiar calculations of peasant life. How much seed remained for planting? Whether the weather would continue favorable? What work needed to be done in the Lord's fields during the coming week? These practical concerns occupied most of his mental energy, leaving little room for the abstract speculation or philosophical questioning that characterized the lives of more educated people. Yet, within the constraints of his circumstances, Thomas found satisfaction and meaning in his daily existence. The successful completion of necessary tasks provided a sense of accomplishment, while the love of his family and the respect of his neighbors gave his life emotional richness and social significance. The rhythm of the seasons and the cycle of agricultural work connected him to natural processes larger than himself, while his religious faith placed his small life within a cosmic framework that promised ultimate meaning and reward for earthly sufferings. As sleep finally claimed him, Thomas entered the peaceful rest that came from physical exhaustion and the knowledge that he had done what was required of him by God, his Lord, and his family. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but also new opportunities to demonstrate the virtues of hard work, patience, and faithfulness that defined the peasant ideal. In his dreams, perhaps he saw the golden fields of a successful harvest, or imagined his children grown and prosperous, carrying forward the traditions and values that had sustained his family through countless generations of agricultural life. The story of Thomas Miller and his family was not extraordinary by the standards of medieval times, but it represents the extraordinary resilience and dignity of ordinary people living in difficult circumstances. Their daily struggles with survival were also daily affirmations of human worth and the possibility of finding meaning and satisfaction even in the most constrained conditions. The medieval peasant's life was hard and often brief, but it was also rich with the fundamental experiences that have defined human existence throughout history: work and rest, love and loss, hope and fear, faith and doubt. In the centuries that would follow Thomas's time, the world would change in ways that would transform the conditions of rural life beyond recognition. Yet the basic human values and experiences that shaped peasant existence would continue to resonate with people in very different circumstances, reminding us of the continuities that connect all human generations, despite the dramatic changes in technology, politics, and social organization. The medieval peasant's commitment to family, community, and faith provides a perspective on modern life that is both challenging and inspiring, suggesting that meaning and satisfaction come not from external circumstances, but from the quality of relationships and the integrity of daily choices. As we conclude this journey through a day in the life of a medieval peasant, we are reminded that history is not just the story of kings and battles, but also the story of ordinary people living ordinary lives with extraordinary courage and persistence. Thomas Miller and his family faced challenges that would overwhelm many modern people. Yet they met these challenges with resourcefulness, dignity, and hope that enabled them not just to survive, but to build the foundations upon which later generations would create new possibilities and new forms of human flourishing.
Their legacy lives on in the values and traditions that continue to shape rural communities around the world. And their example continues to inspire those who seek to find meaning and purpose in their own daily struggles and triumphs. Good night.